Welcome back to the Dershow. I had an exciting weekend. I got to meet with Donald Trump. I got to meet with his new appointee for Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, a lot of the future administration were there. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, today's January 6th. And a terrible thing happened on January 6th, 4 years ago. It was terrible in two different ways. Number one, the event itself, which was a one-off, it will not have a presidential effect at all. It was terrible when it happened. It was wrong. It was right to protest. That's perfectly within the First Amendment, right to petition the government for redress of grievances. I understand those who believe that the election was stolen. I'm not one of them. And you'll hear about that in a minute as well. And President Trump's reaction to my statement that I thought the election was fair and not stolen, but we'll get to that in a minute. But people had a perfect right to protest. Then some of them, including my client, was waved into the House of Representatives by police, and he went in, stayed there, and left. But then there were some people who engaged in physical violence, both property damage and violence against police officers, and particularly the ones who attacked police officers must be punished. They should not be pardoned, and the sentences should not be commuted. They should be sentenced fairly, and they should serve their sentences. What they did was terribly wrong. That was not the worst thing that came out of January 6th. This is going to surprise you. The worst thing that came out of January 6th were what the Democrats did and how they used it, and constructed case after case of lawfare against Donald Trump. They put a permanent stain on the Constitution. They created a terrible, terrible series of precedents, all growing out of January 6th. Most of the cases against Trump, not all of them, were January 6th cases, particularly the case in Washington, D.C., which was the most serious, because in D.C., a District of Columbia jury will convict a Republican ham sandwich, certainly a Republican nominee for president. And the case in Fulton County, Georgia, were both January 6th cases. But it stimulated lawfare also in New York, which was not a January 6th case, a case of a made-up crime by Judge Marchand, who's now going to be sentencing President-elect Trump on Friday, and he's challenging that sentencing, and he's trying to get it put off. He's trying to get it appealed to have the case dismissed based on immunity. Don't know whether he'll succeed or not. My suspicion is that the sentencing will go forward on January, whatever it is, 9th or 10th, and that he'll appeal from that and win his appeal, if not in the lower state court, in the higher state court, or in the United States Supreme Court. So I do think that, and then there was, of course, the Florida case, which has been dismissed. That was not a January 6th case, but it was a lawfare case. So January 6th will be remembered more for the lawfare that grew out of it, creating terrible precedents and introducing a kind of Stalinism to the United States. You know, I've said how many times on this show, Lavrenti Beria's statement of Stalin, "Show me the man, I'll find you the crime." And of course, the Democrats couldn't find any crime, so they made them up. And that was the worst legacy of January 6th. So people will be surprised. I watched today, as in a very distinguished way, Kamala Harris read off the results of the election that she lost. I don't think she was capable of actually winning it. All the excuses the Democrats make that the campaign was too short. I think the longer it would have been, the more votes she would have lost. She was not a good candidate for president. She didn't have the experience and the savvy and the background to govern the United States. She didn't know anything about foreign policy. She would just be a puppet to other people. Trump came in without knowing too much about foreign policy, but he really mastered it quite quickly and did a pretty effective job. I mean, my God, he was nominated didn't get it, of course, because he's Trump, for the Nobel Prize for the Abraham Accords, and did some other great things in foreign policy. Ended the Iranian treaty, which wasn't called a treaty, just called an executive agreement, but it really was a treaty. And did a lot of interesting things. But that was then, and this is now. And so we saw this transition go very, very smoothly. Um, and he will be inaugurated on January 20th. I've been invited to a bunch of the inaugural events, but I'm a little too old for those crowds. So I'm going to stay home and watch it on television and root for Trump to have a great 4 years. I've told him that I will help him in any way I can, and he agreed. And I hope he will consider my advice when it's appropriate and reject it when my advice is inappropriate. I don't want to be an official member of any government. I haven't been in the government since I was a law clerk in 1964. And that's about as close as I want to get to a government job. But I'm happy to be an advisor, a senior advisor, an elder statesman. And last time I saw President Trump, we talked about me being his Henry Kissinger, and he said, "Oh, Alan, you're better looking and smarter than Henry Kissinger." I said, "Better looking, I'll accept that, but smarter, I don't think so." But I have a very good relationship with the president-elect. He likes me. I like him personally. He can't get over the fact that I didn't vote for him in 2016 and 2020. He doesn't know whether I voted for him this time. At the event that which I'll talk about, he, from the stage in front of 1,000 people, he said, "Oh, I'm sure Alan couldn't vote for Kamala Harris. I'm sure he voted for me, but he can't say because his wife, who is a Democrat, wouldn't like it if I said that." So he's convinced I voted for him, and I'm not saying. My wife made me promise not to say, so I'm not saying. You can infer whatever you want, but I'm very much supporting him in the next 4 years. I don't know if I'll go back to voting for Democrats. What President Biden did 2 days ago was one of the most despicable presidential acts that I know of in my lifetime, giving George Soros the Medal of Freedom. George Soros is viciously anti-American, viciously anti-Semitic, Jewish, anti-Semitic. He went around collecting stuff from people who were sent to the death chambers during the Holocaust, and was proud of it. He's always described as a Holocaust survivor. No, he was a Holocaust cooperator. He worked for the Holocaust, not directly, but by collecting items from Jews who had been sent to the camps. He's a despicable person, and hates America, and loves America's enemies, and hates Israel, and hates Jews. And for him to get the Medal of Freedom is despicable. And I could never vote for a president who gave George Soros a Medal of Freedom. I don't know whether Biden knows Soros's history, or whether somebody persuaded him. He's a big donor, but the Medal of Freedom shouldn't be for sale. And if he gave him the Medal of Freedom because he contributed so much money to the Democrats, he also contributed to the election of the prosecutor who was prosecuting Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor who was prosecuting Donald Trump. For that, he gets the Medal of Freedom. He gave money to a lot of hard left progressive prosecutors, many of whom have been thrown out of office. He's been a failure in his politics, but he gets the Medal of Freedom. And I can't support a president who gave him the Medal of Freedom, just like I couldn't support a presidential candidate who said about the protesters who were calling for jihad and revolution and, Hamas, "Oh, they have something to say. You should listen to them." No, they don't have anything to say. They have freedom of speech, just like the Nazis have freedom of speech. But we shouldn't take seriously anything they say. So January 6th, a lot to think about on January 6th. But let's turn to January 20th. We see a new president. We see a new cabinet. I'm generally supportive of his picks. I like Mark Rubio. Mark Rubio was there also on Saturday night. I spoke to him and offered my help, particularly on the Middle East, and he said he would accept it. And the Secretary of the Treasury was there, Scott Bessent. got to talk to him. I really liked him. He seemed like really the nicest guy and very, very, very competent. Um, how it came about, that I saw the president, was a complete accident, really. Um, I was there to speak about the film about John Eastman, about lawfare. And I'm in the film. I have a major role in the film talking about lawfare. And I was there waiting for the event to start. And President Trump obviously found out I was there, and he's told his staff to bring me into his private area. And there he was talking to Scott Bessent, the designee for Secretary of the Treasury. And I sat down with him, and we talked about I can't tell you what we talked about in detail, obviously, but we, talked about lawfare and talked about all the things that are going on, and talked about other things that I'm interested in and things he's interested in. And then I spoke at the event, and he wanted to know what time I was speaking. And I told him 7 o'clock, and he came in at 7 o'clock just as I was speaking, and he stayed for my speech and stood up the whole time in the back, just like an audience member, and cheered when I finished speaking. And then we watched the movie. He came with the Prime Minister of Italy, and the two of them came in and sat there and watched the film. It's interesting because my wife had an interesting reaction. We were sitting, right near them when they were watching the film. And, Trump has a reputation for being a little bit of a flibbity-gibbet, that he can't pay attention. He's always distracted. He can't wait for the event to be over. He did ask me how long my speech would take, because he wanted to stay only for my speech. He said, "How long will your speech take?" And I joked, and I said, "Well, I'm going to go over all of Marchand's errors, each of them, so it'll be 3 or 4 hours." And then he laughed, and I laughed. And I said, "No, it'll be 10 minutes." So he came and he stayed for the speech. But during the movie, which was a riveting movie, my wife watched him. I was watching the movie. My wife watched him, and she said he never took his eyes off the screen. He was obviously riveted by the movie, and he listened very carefully to the interviews that they had with me and with another Harvard professor and with John Eastman, who was the subject of the film. But he clearly paid very, very close attention to the film. And as I said, in the film, I said John Eastman shouldn't be prosecuted for having a different view of the election. Eastman honestly believed the election was stolen. I did not. I thought the election fairly went to Joe Biden. I did think that the Pennsylvania vote was unconstitutional, but even if the Pennsylvania vote was discounted, in my view, there wasn't enough to turn the election over to Donald Trump. Reasonable people could disagree or agree with that. That's what I said. He came over to me afterward and said, "No, I'm wrong." So, all right, I said, I knew what you would say, and we have some disagreements. So he sat during the film and watched it very, very, very carefully, and got up and spoke, and it was a very nice event, a nice evening. There were two events, really. One for the VIPs, as my wife said, the VRPs, the very rich people who had contributed, obviously, to the film or whatever. And that's the people who heard me do my talk. It was part of a panel of 3 or 4 people. Rudolph Giuliani was there. General Flynn was there. And I was there. And the president and the couple of hundred people came and saw that panel discussion about lawfare in general. Then the film came on, and about 1,000 people came and saw the film. It's a great film. You can, I think, access it on television now. It's about John Eastman and justice or lawfare, I think, or something like that. But you can find it, and there it's about the misuses of the law to get people after January 6th. And they got John Eastman. They got him subject to disbarment in California, and a criminal defendant in 2 places. I think I have it right, Arizona and Georgia. And I'm on his side when it comes to the legal issues. Even though I disagree with his legal conclusions, I don't think lawyers should be prosecuted and disbarred for coming up with arguments that are eventually rejected. And President Trump agrees with that completely. But he can't be pardoned because his disbarments and his prosecutions are in states, and in California and Arizona and in Georgia. So he is being very brave about it. But he was a law professor. He was a lawyer, a distinguished law professor, appellate lawyer, and his career has been destroyed because of legal advice he gave. And that's just McCarthyism. And I went to Mar-a-Lago. I drove the 100 and so miles from Miami Beach to Palm Beach in order to show support for a man I disagree with. I never met him until Saturday. I knew who he was, and I know his lawyer, but I didn't know him. I just defend him on principle. And I hope he wins his cases. And I hope the movie is seen by as many people as possible and will persuade. It's very persuasive. Again, my wife, who's a Democrat and who did vote for Kamala Harris, God forgive her. But she was very, very moved by the film, and she was very impressed by it and by the courage that John Eastman has shown in fighting for principles. You start disbarring lawyers for their legal arguments and for who they represent, and you're going to put John Adams and Abraham Lincoln retrospectively in prison. They represented some, pretty controversial and reprehensible people. Abraham Lincoln pulled off one of the greatest tricks ever in a courtroom, and some people think it was unethical. What happened is it was a murder case. Somebody was stabbed, and a witness came forward and said, "I saw him do it." There was no electricity in those days. Well, how did you see him do it? Well, I saw him by the moonlight. The moon was bright that night, and I clearly saw his face, and I saw the knife, and I saw him kill. Well, Abraham Lincoln, the lawyer for the defendant, he was a lawyer. He was probably making $25 to defend this guy. He said, "So you say you saw him by the moonlight, right? Now, what was the night? What was the date?" Gave the date, June 15th, whatever, 1848 or whatever the year might have been. And Lincoln takes a book out of his pocket and throws it across the table and says, "June so-and-so, right? Yeah. Look at the almanac." Looks at the almanac. "Was there a moon that night?" And the guy admits that there was no moon that night. And then he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't really see him. I didn't really see him." And the defendant got acquitted. Well, it turned out that Lincoln gave him the wrong year's almanac. There was a full moon on the night that he claimed he saw him, but there wasn't in a different year, in a different almanac. Some people might disbar a lawyer for doing that. I used to use that case in my class from time to time to see, would you do that? Would you do that? In the film, for example, it says the other lawyer, Larry Lessig, the other law professor, who's very smart and very good guy, he said, of course, if a lawyer lies directly, he can be disbarred. And then he added something. He said, or if he does something that he knows will mislead the jury. See, that's where we disagree. I'll give you an example. I may have given this example before, but it was one of my favorite examples because it grew out of a real case that I used to use in class all the time when people would say, well, you can't mislead the jury. Say you have a client who comes into you and says, I've been accused of robbing the bank at gunpoint, and I've been identified by the teller. She claims she saw me and identified me as the person who robbed the bank. And the lawyer says, all right, I'll cross-examine her. You have anything that would be helpful? He says, yeah, I saw her take her glasses off just before I pulled the gun to rob the bank. And she was fiddling with her hair and holding a mirror up. And she really couldn't have seen me clearly because she wasn't wearing her glasses. And the lawyer says, but she did see you. You were there. Well, yeah, because you wouldn't have been able to tell me she took off her glasses if you weren't there. And so the question is, can the lawyer ask the witness, the woman who said she saw him, can he ask her the following questions? You claim you saw him. Yes. Okay. What is your vision without glasses? Well, it's 50 to 100. So you don't see very well without your glasses. Is that correct? No, I don't. I need to wear my glasses. Isn't it true that when you claim you saw this man, you had taken your glasses off, right? Yeah. And you were kind of fixing your hair, right? So isn't it possible that you didn't see him clearly and you misidentify him? Is that possible? She says, I guess it's possible. So are you allowed as a lawyer to ask that series of questions? You know that you didn't ask him anything that was false. She did take her glasses off. She did have bad vision. But you also know that she properly identified him. You never said she didn't properly identify them. You inferred that, or you implied it so that the jury would infer it. Is that ethically proper? And the students would debate that back and forth. Of course, I never gave them my views. That's not my job. My job is not to teach the students what to think. It's to teach them how to think. So it's a hard question what you're allowed to argue to a jury in the O.J. Simpson case. We didn't argue that O.J. Simpson was innocent. What we argued was that the sock that had O.J. Simpson's blood and the blood of the victim was planted by the police, that they poured blood on a sock. And the inference is, therefore, maybe he's not guilty. But we didn't say that. We just presented the evidence and let the jury draw what inferences it wanted. So it's interesting. And, what John Eastman did is he stated his views on the law, said that if there's a contest in a state about whether the election was properly conducted, you're entitled to put forth an alternate state of electors in the event the court rules that your side won. At least you have the electors ready to go. Today, the electors were counted. If you don't have your alternate slate of electors, then there's no way of challenging the appropriateness of the election and for putting forth slates of electors that ultimately were not certified. He's been disbarred and been prosecuted. There may be other bases as well, but this is the basis that I was focusing on because it's what lawyers do. And so, the film's a great film. I think President Trump thought it was a great film. I could see him clapping. And we'll see what happens in the cases. But I had a good weekend. My wife had a good weekend. Saturday morning, I spoke at a synagogue in Palm Beach and talked about the Bible. And then in the afternoon, I talked about lawfare. And of course, whenever I talk about lawfare, I talk about the Bible. Because the Bible says to judges and prosecutors, you shall not recognize faces. Lo takir panim, do not recognize faces. That's as essential to biblical justice as it is to civil justice. And lawfare is the opposite of that. Lawfare is based on recognizing faces and prosecuting people because of who they are and what party they're in, rather than anything about what they've done. Okay. So let's look at some letters. Oh, I got a lot of letters about Jimmy Carter. Right? I don't think anybody agreed with me on Jimmy Carter. I don't understand why Jimmy Carter was so against Israel. In my view, it's very biblical for Christians to support Israel. Jimmy Carter was on the wrong side of that issue. I regret that. I voted for him twice. I'm no longer a Democrat. Well, Jimmy Carter was on the wrong side of the issue as a biblical scholar because the Bible says, God says to Abraham, I will make you a great nation, Israel. And he who blesses you, I will bless. And he who curses you, I will curse. And so I suspect that God's cursing, not blessing Jimmy Carter for his views on Israel. So even if you do it from a biblical perspective. Apparently, Carter believed that the church replaced Israel after Christ. In other words, the God of Abraham broke his eternal promises and his covenant with Israel. I don't know what his theology was. And, I love theology. And I do this Jew talk sometimes. Some people like it, some don't. Here's one. I love your Jew talk. Would love to take one of your classes remotely. I'm Catholic. Thank you for doing your podcast. I enjoy your perspective on all topics. You might not enjoy my perspective. However, on the current Pope, who has basically said that he believes it's possible that Israel is guilty of genocide. He's just wrong about that. Of course, he doesn't speak ex cathedra about things like that, so Catholics are entitled to totally ignore his political views. They're not entitled to ignore his religious ex cathedra views, but when he talks politically, especially when he doesn't know what he's talking about, which he doesn't when it comes to genocide, whether you're a Catholic or a Jew, you can ignore what he said and make up your own mind, make up your own decision. That's Catholic doctrine, not me speaking. There's a big distinction in Catholic law between a pope or anybody else stating a public political view and stating a view that draws from the Bible. The Pope never said that he gets his views about genocide in Israel from the Bible, because if he did, you'd have to be misquoting the Bible. It'd be dead wrong. The Bible says if they are coming to kill you, rise up and kill him first. Okay. All right. Professor, about the Jew talk. Thank you. As someone who grew up with almost no interaction of Jewish folks, I appreciate your fair and balanced lessons, Jewish history and culture, ever since this 1976 hostage rescue from Entebbe. When I was 18, Bibi's brother was killed, as you know, Yehonatan. I have the utmost respect for Israel and often been stumped by the lack of respect for Israel and Israelis in this country. You know, most Americans support Israel. It's the hard left and some on the hard right that don't support Israel. Extremists have a lot in common. And one thing extremists on both sides, very, very, very hard neo-Nazi right and very, very hard neo-communist left, they have in common is they hate Israel. They usually don't have very good feelings about Jews either. Carter, in addition to everything else, he politicized the Olympics. He did. Remember, he canceled the Olympics. We've always thought he was a horrible president. America weak. Jews should boycott Poland. Going to Poland, period. Spend tourist money elsewhere. I agree. Until Poland withdraws its threat to arrest Netanyahu for nothing that he did improper, I don't think that the memorial for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz should be attended by any decent people. Let the Poles and the Ukrainians who helped kill the Jews go there and apologize, but let not the victims go and support a prime minister or a president who threatens to arrest the elected leader of Israel. All right. I said Carter didn't like very many Israelis, and somebody pointed out correctly, he did like Aaron Barak, my friend, who was the president of the Supreme Court of Israel. He did like him. That's true. But he liked him because Barak was arguing with Begin all the time, and he didn't like Begin, so he liked Barak. And now look, everybody likes Barak. Aaron Barak is a great man with a great wife who just tragically died a couple of weeks ago. All right. One person says, you really are a contrarian. An interesting argument. The post-POTUS rating of Carter, more persuasive than that of his presidency. Regarding an attorney defending a guilty client, this is a cornerstone of our judicial system. The state should not have the ability to take a citizen's freedom without proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt. It is the defense attorney's job to make sure the state meets that standard. I couldn't agree more. I don't understand why so many people who write you can't grasp this. If they were in trouble within the law, they would be the first ones looking for the best lawyer they could afford, of course. And in my case, you don't even have to afford me. I do half my cases pro bono. I'm not doing very many cases these days at age 86, but throughout my career, half of my cases have been pro bono. And then somebody criticized me for speaking ill of the dead because I made these points the day after Carter died. You have to speak ill of the dead when they die, because otherwise nobody will listen. Nobody's going to be talking about Jimmy Carter a year from now or 6 months from now. But now they're all praising him. This is exactly the right time to produce the other side, to produce evidence of what he did being bad. You can't just allow the praise to go forward. So I made a deliberate choice. A good friend of mine, very close friend of mine, condemned me for it and said, no, you should have waited a few months. No, that's not right. You wouldn't get any attention. You strike while the iron is hot, and the iron is hot right now. All right, so this is a full week. Unlike the last 2 weeks, no holidays. So Hanukkah's over, Christmas is over, New Year's over. I don't know what the status of Kwanzaa is, but be back tomorrow and be back Wednesday, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting things to talk about. See you then.